Yeah.
Everyone wave. We have 6 people.
Hey.
And then our camera girl. Okay. Think back to 8th grade Georgia history. How many of you can remember who founded our state? Okay, a couple. How about when our state was established? What year?
In the 1700s.
Good, good. What about the first city?
Savannah.
Good job. But if you are unable to answer any of these questions, no worries. I may be able to help. The purpose of this speech is to inform you of a little something called the Trustee Vision. The Trustee Vision was a very specific plan for the establishment of Colonial Georgia. It was defined by James Oglethorpe and the 20 other founders, and it's based on very progressive notions of class equality and equal opportunity. In our discussion, I hope to convey all the details of the vision's history, implementation, and eventual collapse. Ultimately, I hope this information will provide a more encompassing historical picture of the state in which you live. So, who's ready for a much-needed history lesson?
Me.
Let's begin. So the British made their first claim on Georgia in 1663. This is 100 years after St. Augustine is founded. That's the first permanent settlement in North America. And this is just a claim on the land. Georgia is still not yet a colony. Not until 16 years later in 1732, when James Oglethorpe finally receives a royal charter to make Georgia an official British colony. Keep in mind, this is only about 40 years before the Revolutionary War. So the charter is actually granted to Oglethorpe and 20 other trustees. Oglethorpe and the trustees are very intent on making Georgia different than the other British colonies. So this is how the Trustee Vision is born. The vision has 3 main components. First and foremost, the colony is to have no slaves. There's a couple reasons for this. Neighboring South Carolina and Virginia are dominated by wealthy plantations and plantation owners due to slave labor. And the Trustee Vision was quite humanitarian in nature. They wanted Georgia to be a colony of opportunity for the little guy. You may have also heard that Georgia was a place to send an overflow of criminals from debtors' prisons. Well, this is actually just a myth. Oglethorpe and the trustees don't want to fail, because then their charter will be revoked. Everyone is actually carefully screened before coming to the colony. Next, the trustees cannot profit. They cannot own land or make any money from the charter. And finally, there is to be no self-government. By this time, Virginia has its House of Burgesses and is practicing self-government. The trustees saw this as contradictory to their goals. So the colony itself is a rather humanitarian experiment for its time. But unfortunately, enthusiasm for the vision begins to decline rather quickly. There's a few reasons for this. One, there's a pretty significant population decline. In 1732, 2,800 people arrive in the colony. By 1741, there's less than half of that number remaining in Georgia. In comparison, neighboring South Carolina has about 20,000 white people and another 40,000 slaves. But really, the overriding reason for the vision's decline has to do with a little idea known as errand in the wilderness. So let's venture back to 17th century Puritans living in Massachusetts. The quote, "errand in the wilderness," is actually taken from a Puritan sermon. When the Puritans came to America, or the wilderness, they had a task, or an errand, of establishing a model society built on purity. But this errand was simply a European idea planted on American soil. This wilderness greeted Puritans with the absence of law and rule. The Puritans did not foresee the temptations that awaited, namely self-government, money, and success. These things Europe could not offer the Puritans. So, in a sense, the wilderness destroyed the original task of the Puritans, their errand of building a pure and perfect society. So, you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with colonial Georgia? Well, have you ever heard the saying, history repeats itself? Much like the first Puritans in the New World, the colonists of Georgia did not foresee the temptations of the wilderness. Specifically, the trustees failed to foresee the temptations of self-government and profitability provided by slave labor. By the early 1750s, enthusiasm for the trustee vision has greatly diminished, and the original charter is rewritten. In the early 1750s marks the onset of the royal period in colonial Georgia and the end of the trustee period. Ultimately, the trustee experiment with Georgia was impractical because the people of Georgia saw all the opportunities for wealth and power provided to the other colonies, and they couldn't have these. In conclusion, the Trustee vision of Georgia as a humanitarian experiment met a quick and ultimate failure. Reasons for this are because of the notion of an errand in the wilderness and the temptations of self-rule and material success. I hope this speech has broadened your understanding of our state's foundations and inspired a more historical understanding of our nation as a whole. Thank you.
That was good.